Okay, welcome to our first server training on the topic of human trafficking. My name is Michelle Flagg with the Industry Education Division at the Illinois Liquor Control Commission. If you are BASIS certified, then you are familiar with the Human Trafficking Resource Center Act. It requires specified businesses and other establishments to post a notice informing the public and victims of human trafficking of telephone hotline numbers to seek help or to report unlawful activity. The ILCC comes into play because on-premise consumption retailer licensees under the Liquor Control Act of 1934, where the sale of alcoholic liquor is the principal business carried on by the licensee at the premises, and primary to the sale of food, are one of the specified businesses. Victims of human trafficking may not know where to turn for assistance and can be too intimidated to ask for help. The training today will cover definitions, myths, and signs to look for. On the screen, I have a copy of the Human Trafficking Resource Center Notice Act. And you'll see that the 800 number is available on the notice. As I mentioned, the training today will cover definitions, myths, and signs to look for. Thank you for joining us today for this very important topic. At this time, I'd like to welcome Laura Ng from the Chicago Children's Advocacy Center.
Sounds good. So I use Zoom. So if I am just kind of figuring out what I'm doing here, I request some patience here. But my name is Laura Ng, and I'm so happy to be with you guys. And I actually really love speaking to smaller groups because, as I just learned, human trafficking is not news to any of you. It's actually part of your training, and I'm sure even in real life, human trafficking is not news to you either. So I'd much rather have a discussion. Some of the information that I have here is probably going to be pretty basic for our conversation now that I know that you guys have a lot of foundational knowledge. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. I have some discussion questions, kind of right off the bat, and after a couple slides after I kind of talk about why the CAC is doing this training for you. So, but real quick about me, it might help to learn that I am a social worker by training. Prior to that, actually, I had a whole other life in pension administration. Most people don't know what pensions are anymore, unless, of course, you work in government. But I actually had 10 years in there before I decided that I no longer wanted to do that and wanted to actually do work instead. So I actually started a nonprofit several years ago, a little over a decade ago, called Traffic Free. So I was the executive director of that small nonprofit in Chicago for about 10 years. And in that, we actually grew with the recognition of what human trafficking was, especially in Cook County, Illinois. The federal government had already recognized what human trafficking was around 2000. Prior to that, we were a lot of times recognizing that human trafficking was something that happened to foreign-born individuals, but we weren't really looking domestically. And so when it came to Cook County in the state of Illinois, we really started looking at the issue in 2010. So that's kind of when I started doing my work, realizing that this was an issue. And so we created an organization that worked to develop a kind of no questions asked. If you just need to come in and find like-minded people who have lived experiences like you, working in sex work, but just needed hygiene products or a shower, a place to rest for a few hours, whatever that might look like. That's what we worked for about 10 years to do. So a lot of my career, I learned from a lot of experts around me in Cook County. And then we also were able to work with adult female identified survivors or victims or people who just never identified with having faced any kind of trauma, but came into our drop-in center just to access a shower or food or a place to rest for a few hours. So I do have 10 years of experience working with adults, but I did come over to the CAC in 2019 and started working with children. And it's one of those things where, when you work with adults, our number one goal was never to convince somebody to leave the life. no matter what our opinion about their safety might be, but it's really just to let them know that there are resources out there if they decided they wanted another life, plan. But when it comes to kids, of course, kids who are either at high risk or have already been victims of human trafficking, my number one role is to prevent future victimization. And so my service plan for the kids that I work with are to reduce the current risk factors that might increase their risk for future victimization. So our goals in working with minors and adults are very different. We recognize that adults have a lot more autonomy. Obviously, their brains get more fully developed. But when it comes to kids, like I said, our goal is a little bit different. So I am the human trafficking specialist here at the CAC. And so because I've been doing this work for over a decade at this point, is, hopefully a good reason why I have been invited to do this training for you. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on here, but if you live in the city of Chicago, if you've ever passed by this colorful building on Damon off of Roosevelt, this is the Chicago Children's Advocacy Center. Here we receive referrals from our partners from CPD, DCFS, a whole host of other law enforcement for children who have experienced any kind of abuse. And our boundary limitation is the city of Chicago. There are other CACs all across the country, all across Cook County, all across Illinois. And we all basically do the same thing, which are the services that are listed here. We receive referrals for forensic interviews so that children no longer have to be interviewed individually by DCFS investigator, individually by law enforcement. They actually come to a child-friendly environment where they do an interview with one of our trained forensic interviewers, and then they're met with family advocacy, child life, mental health services, family support services. If you are more interested in what we do at the CAC, I'm happy to talk to you offline, but I know that that's not the purpose of our discussion here. We have all of these partners that are actually in-house in that colorful building that I showed a few slides ago. And if you do suspect that human trafficking is happening to a child, or you just have suspicions or concerns, you actually initially just make that initial hotline call to DCFS. And so all trafficking allegations are taken by DCFS for investigation. The law just changed earlier this year. If you've ever worked with DCFS, all might say that when that person is in a caretaking role, either like a parent or a teacher or a coach or something like that, then they're an ineligible perp for DCFS investigation. That is no longer true. Earlier this year, we actually were able to change DCFS statute to say that suspected traffickers are instantly in an eligible perp role. So they do take trafficking cases, and so that should be one of your first calls, unless of course you think somebody is in immediate danger. Call 911. And we'll respond to the unfortunate, just high numbers of trafficking cases among children at the Chicago CAC with a very unique structure here. We do have a CSEX specialist. CSEX stands for Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children. That is my colleague, Tiffany. I'm the human trafficking specialist. And so basically her and I do the exact same thing. We just have different titles because of the way that we're funded. And then we also have a human trafficking therapist. And as we go into a little bit more this morning about discussion of what intervention really looks like to reduce those risk factors, we know that relationship a lot of times is what keeps victims, be they adult or children, with their trafficker. And so we intervene with these relationships instead to hopefully break down the barrier and the bond that victims feel with their perpetrators, basically. And so I use the word victim because I'm now in a very in an environment that's very investigation heavy. So that's one of the main reasons I use the word victim. It is by no means a word that I would ever use with any of my clients. Even if I went back to work with adults or currently work with children, I would never use the word directly with any of my clients. And as my clients are called, as I refer to them now, they're all just my kids. So we can talk about stories. I would rather answer your questions, because like I said, I know that there's going to be overlap with information that you already know. But I just want to share with you that, when we think about human trafficking, I don't know how often this group has seen human trafficking come into your establishments or in any other part of your life, or if you have individuals in your lives that work in social work or schools or any other kind of industry that might see this a little bit more often. And so here at the CAC, our fiscal year is July 1st to June 30th. So we just closed out the last fiscal year. And then that last fiscal year, we provided services, the three of us on that previous slide, provided services to 135 victims that accounted for 192 cases. And so this doesn't mean that we saw 135 kids were all confirmed human trafficking victims, but a lot of them were at least showing some level of risk or some sort of suspicion that either an investigator felt, something could be a human trafficking allegation, or even myself or any of my other colleagues here, we may have listened to a case and be like, you know what, there's something more happening here than, quote unquote, like just a sexual abuse case. And so we really do push for human trafficking charges because it um, provides for heavier penalties for the offenders. And so it's really important to us that these cases are charged appropriately. And so getting up to date on the laws, including the new revision with DCFS statutes and who is an eligible perp is super important so that we can actually go ahead and prosecute and put these on people's records that they're actually a human trafficking perpetrator. And so I will say that there's that asterisk down there that most cases are referred as allegations of child sexual abuse. That's what CA stands for, not human trafficking. So I will tell you that most of those 192 cases did come into the CAC as child sexual abuse, but because of those red flags that we're trained to see here, we escalated them to the point where we stepped in and provided services instead. So how does that compare? We saw 192 cases that we responded to the last year. Polaris is the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. They run the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is that hotline that's posted in all those posters that you guys are posting in your establishments. And so they don't have statistics for 2020 just yet. I don't know, of course, all of us in different ways. But these were their 2019 statistics, and I just wanted to throw these out there that these are based on phone calls that they actually receive the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So that hotline is not just for if you need help, you need a hotline to call or text, you can call or text that phone number. But it's also for anybody like you and I who just might want additional resources. Let's just say you're traveling and, Illinois has this statute in bars and restaurants that, you are required to post this notice. But let's say you go to work in another state and you don't know what local human trafficking resources there are. You can always call the National Human Trafficking Hotline and ask, hey, I think something's happening over here. Can you give me some resources here locally? And so those are the reasons that the National Hotline is set up. And in 2019, based on just those phone calls, they were able to identify about 434 victims in the state of Illinois alone. So the stats you're looking here are just in the state of Illinois. You'll see that a lot of that red, I know the slide looks a little bit hard to see, but you can actually just Google Polaris Project, and they have all their statistics on the National Human Trafficking Hotline up on there. So you'll see that their statistics are just really don't match what we're seeing. And so as advocates here for children to prevent them from future victimization, if they've either shown red flags for future or current victimization, or have risk factors for future victimization, we need to do a better job at identification. And so that is a huge part of my job here is to work with our law enforcement partners and work with our DCFS investigators to be like, no, there's something more happening here. And so I've been here for about 2 years at this point, coming up on 2 years. And it's still kind of, I'll tell you, it's kind of an uphill battle because everybody has their own personal biases of what constitutes human trafficking, right? I'll have cases that have come in where the law enforcement detective might be like, well, this wasn't real human trafficking because this 13-year-old girl was really just posting herself and there really wasn't anybody forcing her to do it. And so for us, we know what the laws are, and we know that no 13-year-old girl, let alone 16 or 15-year-old girl or boy, can post themselves online selling sex because that is not the age of consent in the state of Illinois. The age of consent is 17. So you can't do that in any other form if you can't consent. So I'll try to get off as many soapboxes as possible for the next hour. But I wanted to hear from everybody else. So if you want to, put your camera on, or actually don't know how WebEx's chat looks, but if you want to unmute yourself, I want to have this conversation just to see. I know that human trafficking is not new to anybody here. So I want to know, either in your professional life or your personal life, do you believe you've ever encountered a victim of human trafficking, and what makes you say yes, if any of you are going to say yes?
This is Tony Dean. I personally have not encountered a victim of human trafficking that I know of. Dave, have you?
No, I have not either that I'm aware of.
Are there any, maybe even third-party stories that you want to share? Like, how did that person realize that the individual was a victim of human trafficking? Anybody want to share?
I was muted, but I don't think I know of any, but again, I would say I'm new to knowing what to look for. So I may not know, like after the presentation, then I might go back and think of different scenarios and say, oh, okay, I mean, it seemed odd at the time, but maybe, more could have been going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody, no right or wrong answers, does anybody want to take a stab at what would make you think that human trafficking might be happening at your establishment? Or like even in your everyday life, like outside of work, like what do you think, oh, that could have been human trafficking? Anybody want to take a quick stab at a scenario?
I would say maybe with restaurants, with the staff, if they don't, um, like if I was a regular and they didn't seem to have a life like outside of the restaurant or didn't do anything outside of the restaurant, um, and so they'll maybe too tied to their place of employment.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, so when we talk about human trafficking, obviously we're not just talking about customers who are coming in, but we're talking about people who actually do the work at the establishments that we're talking about. So thank you for that. So I'm going to skip over the next couple of slides because I didn't realize that you guys had already covered this. But of course, my concern sometimes is that I think, obviously I'm talking to the right audience with people who have done the BASSET training, BASSET trainers, Illinois Liquor Commission. You guys are logged on here because you already know something about human trafficking. So the unfortunate thing sometimes though is that, I am no stranger to going out. I do live in Chicago. I love the foods. I love, some of the bar scenes. I love, Wednesday wing night specials. And because I've been doing this work for a long time, I actually do look for those postings of where's the human trafficking sign in this establishment. And of course, the law says it's supposed to be in a conspicuous place, which means I should be able to see it pretty easily, either somewhere by the door or maybe in the bathroom. And I can't tell you the number of places that I don't see it at. So these are not the slides that I need to convince this group of, and I absolutely understand that, but I would love to help in any way possible to reach those bars that maybe aren't doing this. And of course, sometimes I don't, it's a human nature thing, right? I don't always want to be the person who's like, hey, there's a law that you're not following. Nobody wants that person.
Well, one thing I was going to say, Laura, we're recording this. So although the audience is primarily BASSET and they're familiar with it, still cover some of the other things that you're going to cover because someone watching it can then be armed with that knowledge because the average person may not know that those signs are supposed to be conspicuous. And then that way, the next time they're out at a bar and they don't see it, it can be, and then it's not all on you. It can be, common like, hey, where's your sign? That type of thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you, Michelle. And so, well, let me go ahead and go into this then. This slide here, Human Trafficking Resource Center notice, of which was effective January 1st, 2016. These are the named establishments that are required to have this posting of resources and that National Human Trafficking Hotline number that Michelle had shared at the very beginning of this presentation. And of course, that number one bullet point there, businesses where the sale of alcohol is the principal business and that holds on-premise consumption retailer licenses under the Liquor Control Act of 1934. You'll see a lot of these other establishments that are listed here. So for those of you who, just in your everyday life, go to airports or ride the train, have to go to the hospital, or, you know, private job recruitment centers if you're looking for another job for some reason. You know, these are the notices, these are the places where this notice is supposed to be up and visible. And so it's funny when I was looking at this this legislation, and you know, people like to use big words, but I did confirm that the word conspicuous doesn't mean that it's supposed to be visible. Like it's not supposed to be hidden. So you know, when you, like I said, when you walk in to the entrance, the exit, or the bathroom areas where you would normally post where your liquor license is, this should be somewhere also just as visible. And so
We, can we throw in a comment? This is Tony
yeah.
Dean, Dave Brock. We do a cosmetology continuing ed class here in Texas. And one of the places that these signs should be displayed is in the salons, hair salons, because a lot of times they will take the human traffickers, people into those places to clean them up. And the salon, the cosmetologists are taught to look for bruises and other incidents or signs.
The way they act, their personality, if they look nervous or if they act like somebody's watching them. There's a lot of different things that they teach them in these schools. That way they can help these people.
Oh, that's great.
So just an FYI.
Yeah, that's great.
Sure thing.
So yeah, let's definitely continue to have this discussion because you guys are the frontline workers here. And I just actually want to throw the slide up here and ask a more curious question than anything else. Do we think the angel shot works?
What is an angel shot?
That actually is a really good question. Does anybody else have an opinion on this question?
Oh, Dave knows.
It's an urban myth. I didn't know it was something that was really done.
It's interesting because I have friends who work in the service industry, and so I would say 50% of the time they know what this means, and 50% of, you know, whenever I ask this question, they don't know. And I was very surprised. I put the slide up here because as I was preparing this presentation, I was out recently and I noticed that there was actually a sign in the bathroom telling me that, you know, if I needed help, I should go to the bar and order an angel shot. And I was like, well, that's interesting. And I remember several years ago, I had seen what was a news segment saying that, you know, people have come up with this idea of an angel shot so you can go up to the bar and order one. And I know that that faced a lot of criticism because people were like, well, if this is widespread now, and if people know that people are going to be ordering angel shots, what's to stop a perpetrator or a trafficker from listening in and be like, no, you're not going to do that. And so I was just curious if this was something that was actually, like you said, it's an urban myth. Great, because the whole point of this training is to train all of us to be able to spot it more and not have the burden on the victim to identify for themselves that they actually need help. And so when we talk about human trafficking, of course, it's important to make sure that we're defining it correctly. So I just want to show, I'm going to show a couple videos during this presentation. This will be the first one here. Oftentimes when I'm asked to be given these presentations, I'm typically talking to audiences who know a little bit about human trafficking and wouldn't say I, wouldn't be able to spot it, at all. But it's interesting to me because I do still, sometimes get into social situations where they're like, oh, human trafficking, that doesn't happen here. So, hopefully some of this information, even if it's, not news to you, that it's information that you would share, in your social circles as well. And so what we saw in that video were basically two types of human trafficking that are very commonly discussed: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Some people silo out the domestic servitude piece of it, but we can really kind of envelop that under labor trafficking. Some people might also argue that sex trafficking is just another form of labor trafficking and a different venue, or different acts of labor trafficking. So all of that can be arguable, but we just need to make sure that we're talking about, when we talk about human trafficking, we're talking about human trafficking as a whole, because oftentimes we do just talk about sex trafficking and use that term interchangeably, which kind of is actually a good segue for my next couple of slides of common misconceptions. When we talk about human trafficking, I'm gonna show you the federal definition of it. It's very clear, it's very closely tied to the Illinois definition of it. It's very closely tied to Chicago Police definition of it. But I can throw out definitions to people and they're very jargon heavy. But I think sometimes when we talk about human trafficking, talking about the myths and misconceptions is a little bit easier for us to grasp. We're like, oh yeah, no, that wasn't human trafficking. And so this first bullet point here that I point out is that human trafficking and sex trafficking can be used interchangeably. Common misconception. Do not use those interchangeably. So even you in your everyday life, make sure that if you're talking about human trafficking, you're talking about human trafficking as a whole. But if you're just talking about sex trafficking, then just talk about sex trafficking. So we need to make sure that as often as we talk about human trafficking, we need to be talking about labor trafficking. And we'll talk about the prevalence of labor trafficking and why we need to pay so much attention to it, but it's so much harder to identify. And so one of the things that I don't remember if I had in the slide earlier is that most of the cases that we've seen here just at the CAC in the last couple of years are sex trafficking cases, because those are just easier to identify. So we need to train ourselves to identify labor trafficking a lot better. And so we'll touch on a little bit of that on this morning as well. Another common misconception: individuals must be physically restrained or somehow not allowed to leave to be considered a victim, which of course you guys have already shared this morning, that that there are signs to look for, that somebody's not going to walk into your establishment who's already being physically restrained. They may be emotionally restrained, they may be mentally restrained, they may have been taught to do certain things like not make eye contact, or not pull out their own money to pay for their own drinks, not go to their go to the bathroom by themselves, whatever that might be. And we know that individuals do not need to be physically restrained. And I can't tell you, sometimes even the cases that I see here and some of the multidisciplinary team members that I work with, which includes investigators, other social workers, that, we still have this idea that it's got to be this like Taken Liam Neeson scenario where that's what human trafficking looks like, when we know full well that's not what it looks like. And then something else that's, that goes viral a lot, including in my own Facebook neighborhood group, white vans with fewer blacked out windows is a common vehicle used by traffickers. We know that this is something that has been portrayed in the media for a very, very long time. That if there's going to be a young girl who's going to be kidnapped, she's going to be pulled into a white van or maybe a black van. And so even recently, I would say in the last year, my neighborhood Facebook group, there was somebody who posted about how there was this mysterious white van that was going down an alley, and whatever it was that they were doing, and the person who posted it decided to post a photo of the full license plate. Totally could have just been an innocent person looking for things like that were furniture put on the side of dumpsters type of thing going down an alley. And this poor person who was driving a white van instantly, was just made to be the suspicious person. And so law enforcement has come out and said time and time again that there is no preferred vehicle for offenders, and this whole white van thing is a myth. That's all it is. That's been perpetrated by media and Law and Order SVU and other movies. We thankfully know this is no longer, I think, a very common misconception that only foreign-born individuals are victims, especially undocumented ones. What we do know about foreign-born and undocumented individuals, that's a population of individuals that are more at risk of being trafficked for labor. And so when we talk about labor trafficking in establishments that are serving alcohol, restaurants, all of these establishments where there might be a higher amount of employees who might be undocumented, they may be trafficked for labor because they have fewer resources to turn to for money and to make a living. So we can talk about that a little bit later this morning too. There's something that went viral, I think, a couple years ago at this point. And so I put this bullet point up here that online retailers use high pricing as an indicator that an item is a child for sale. Does this bullet point ring any bells for anybody in the news in the last couple of years? No. So there's this one thing that went viral. So you have to kind of be on social media, I guess, for some of these, to have gone viral and, gone past, your purview here. But somebody basically wanted to buy a cabinet from Wayfair and realized that some of those cabinets had human names that they were named after. And so somehow started this rumor that went viral that this highly priced cabinet must really actually be a child for sale. And so it went, anytime these things go viral, I have friends in my regular everyday life who will be like, Laura, is this true? Laura, is this true? And so before I say, I don't think it's true, I always then check back with my experts who have lived experiences, who run, national organizations, like, hey, is this true, before I go back to my friends and say, usually when things go viral, they're usually not true. And so, of course, it turns out not to be true, but it took a long time for all of this to be taken off of social media. So always be wary of things that go viral, and we all already know that. Another bullet point, if there's no evidence of a trafficker, a minor is not considered a victim. So I don't know that this has been a law passed in all 50 states at this point, but at least in the state of Illinois, that if an individual who is engaged in commercial sex is under the age of 18, and commercial sex can just be online, exchange of child sexual abuse material, it could be in person. Once again, that age of consent is super important. The age of consent is 17, but when it comes to human trafficking, if that individual is under the age of 18, which includes 17-year-olds, and they're involved in commercial sex, they are automatically to be treated as a victim of human trafficking. Investigators, no matter who you are, independent investigators, inspector generals, whoever you are, you don't need to have identified that there might be a possible trafficker who's forcing that young person to engage in commercial sex. But that person, under Illinois state law, you can make that hotline call to DCFS, and they are required to take that for investigation at this point with that new law that changed. And then last myth that gets talked about, I think the term human trafficking has that word traffic in there. And so a lot of people still think that it has to involve moving somebody from one location to another, which of course it doesn't. We know that individuals are trafficked out of private homes and private businesses, which of course that's actually the number one places that people are trafficked out of are private homes and private businesses, be it labor trafficking or sex trafficking. And so when we start having these multimedia campaigns, which should not stop. I am absolutely not advocating for campaigns to stop about raising awareness about the Super Bowl. But a long, long time ago, there was somebody who had said that, oh, the Super Bowl is the number one human trafficking incident all year, and we really need to up our investigations and eyes on the ground and eyes online as well for potential victims who are being sold. And absolutely, we should keep doing that. But we need to also dispel the myth that the Super Bowl or any large events like that is the number one biggest human trafficking incident, because it happens year round and it doesn't take holidays. And it also didn't really care about the pandemic. So we'll talk a little bit about that too, because human trafficking did not decrease during the pandemic. So I'm going to throw some definitions out at you. This is the federal definition for labor trafficking. And so basically when we're talking about human trafficking, essentially what we're all talking about is the use of somebody for the profit of somebody else without compensating that individual for what their work was worth. And so when we talk about labor trafficking, one of my colleagues a long time ago, I steal this from her, but one of the things that she kind of put it in layman's terms of, if you ask somebody, can you leave your job? And they say no, the reasons they tell you they can't leave their job is going to make what is, there's just no opportunities out there, but they really, they're not being forced to stay at this job, or if it's labor trafficking. If they start having conversations of like, well, they have my passport, or they will report me to immigration. A lot of those threats can actually be considered labor trafficking. It can be considered a whole host of other things as well. But that's when we talk to the Department of Labor to go over cases. And so the Department of Labor is actually pretty well versed in labor trafficking. So we do work with city level and county level and state level Department of Labor individuals And so they're always willing to go out to establishments. They're willing to talk to people anonymously. But at the end of the day, they do work for the government. And so, we hear stories all the time of people who might come forward to an everyday person, but then as soon as, the Department of Labor is involved, then they, kind of clam up and don't want to talk anymore. So when it comes to some of this stuff, just be really careful of who you send out to an establishment, because you don't want to scare somebody off and, and then the labor trafficking continues. But essentially that's what we're talking about. But we're not talking about it enough. And we know we're not talking about it enough because time and time again, all of our investigations, the majority of investigations, no matter where you look, city level, county level, state level, federal level, are still mostly sex trafficking. But we know that according to the International Labor Organization, that for every victim of sex trafficking, there are 9 victims of labor trafficking. They're just so much more hidden, and especially when we talk about immigrant populations. If there's bars or restaurants that are run and open in highly immigrant populations and maybe suspected undocumented individual populations, then there's a higher risk of exploitation because people are very insulated there. And you kind of, as a Chinese American, I'll tell you that we keep a lot of things to ourselves. We don't invite the general public, into our lives and tell them that something might be happening here. But it's our responsibility to go into those places, and our responsibility, even as patrons and customers, be like, actually, I think something might be happening here. What can I do? And so sometimes it is calling the National Human Trafficking Hotline if you suspect something might be happening. I had a story a long time ago when I was first started to do this work over 10 years ago, where we had a story where we were driving down an area of Chicago where nothing really was open. And so my friend and I were driving, we both started doing anti-human trafficking work together. And we had noticed that there was this massage establishment that was open late at night. Nothing else is open in the area. This is weird. And so this is the time when Blackberries were the most popular phones. And so we both pulled out our Blackberry. And so we're looking at the name of this place. We're learning what human trafficking is. Something's not right here. And so we pulled out our phones, and she did something that I thought back then was super brilliant. And she looked up the telephone number of this place, or the address. I don't remember which one. And it was the address or the telephone number that started popping up in all of these sites that were clearly selling illicit sex. And so we shared that story. And then, I've shared that story multiple times in numerous trainings. And then I think a few years later, there was a woman who had contacted us and was like, I was getting my nails done. And at first, things just didn't seem right. And I had asked whether or not, they were going to put a top coat because they were telling me my nails were done and they weren't giving me a top coat. So then she started noticing other things around her, like just every once in a while, there would be a man who would walk through the nail establishment and go to a back door and never come back out. And so with that, she kind of left the establishment and started looking up exactly, the address or the telephone number, and the same thing happened. The address or the telephone number started popping up on these illicit sex sites. And so then, we were able to direct her to make the correct phone calls to the appropriate authorities. And so we know that human trafficking or labor trafficking is happening a lot more prevalently than sex trafficking. And we just need to train ourselves to be able to recognize those red flags and make those phone calls that maybe make us a little bit uncomfortable. We don't know if we're making the right phone call, but always better to be right for the victim, for the potential victim, than, it's no skin off your back if you're just wrong and you made a phone call and it made you feel ridiculous that you made, a phone call.
Now, Laura, a quick question. Do you think, because we have in our enforcement division, we have enforcement agents that will go and do an inspection. Do you think sending out someone like that sometimes could be like tip them off less than if it were a labor person?
I mean, I guess it depends on what that individual, I guess how they carry themselves. If these are pre-scheduled, or are they, just random site inspections type of thing?
Well, before they get their license, they'll have a inspection. And then if they receive complaints, then there may be so usually the pre-license, that is that's scheduled, but if there's complaints, that may not be scheduled.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, if there's a complaint and then, they're not scheduled, I think that's fine. I think, it's when the Department of Labor investigator goes out and it's pre-scheduled, and it's like, then, they might start talking to all the other employees that are like, oh, this person's coming out, and if there's any fear about immigration, then unfortunately, I do even know from my personal friends that's a lot of times when people start, kind of protecting each other, and you'd rather protect the immigration status than get help for potential labor trafficking case. So I don't have an easy answer to your question. But, I think one of the great things about working at an environment like the CAC is that we get to work together. And so as an advocate, I get to tell my kids that I don't work for DCFS. I don't work for law enforcement. I'm here to advocate for them. I'm here to support them. And I really wish there was a model like that for adults as well, that you could send in a social worker first. And then, kind of talk through whether or not they even want to move forward with different aspects of investigation. And if they don't, then, just respecting that piece as well. Back to this organization called Polaris. I throw this out here. They had taken 10 years, I think, to compile all of their phone calls. And when they receive a phone call at the human trafficking hotline, they don't ask a lot of questions. They are going to receive the information that you have and then pass it along to the local agency that might need to get more information from you. But they do collect as much information as they possibly can about the initial call or the allegation that you're making. And so they basically spent 10 years compiling all their data and trying to figure out within the United States alone, this is not even worldwide, but within the United States alone, where labor trafficking calls and tips were coming from. And a couple slides later, I'll also share where they were sharing that sex trafficking tips were coming from and what venues they were coming from. And so I bolded a few of these places here. And so when we talk about susceptibility, vulnerability in certain venues for labor trafficking, we're talking a lot about industries that are transient, industries where it's not a consistent, every single day you're going to clock in, like I might see Michelle at the office every single day and I'll be like, hey, I kind of noticed that like right after that bruise healed, you kind of got like more bruises and it's been consistent. Or like I've seen you over this last year and you just keep losing weight. Is everything okay? So we don't have that consistency in a lot of these industries. So not only is that their lack of consistency, but there's also this like traveling aspect to a lot of these industries. And so there's those two things. And then when we look at things like in-home healthcare, these are individuals who are going into a job working by themselves. There's nobody else who's going in and be like, hey, are you okay? And so if they're being trafficked for, personal home health care, personal domestic servitude, whatever that might be, then it's basically one employer who sees that person every single day, and that one employer could be their trafficker. And so we need to pay attention just as, overall investigators in any industry that you get to investigate crime in, that we pay attention to certain industries because this is what has been tracked over 10 years of phone calls. And when we talk about sex trafficking, here's a definition for you. I'm not going to go over it. You can get these slides, by the way, at the end of this presentation. But I want to make sure that we cover this definition here. And so when people start talking about human trafficking and sex trafficking, people have different definitions of what sex trafficking is. I have a very wide definition of what sex trafficking is, because one of the biggest pieces of this definition that you'll see, no matter if you're talking to police or child welfare, or state legislation, city legislation, there's always this piece of commercial sex act. And people might start thinking is like, oh, well, if I'm the trafficker, then I'm selling this person to somebody else. That's not necessarily what commercial sex act means. Commercial sex act, if you look at the definition from the Office on Trafficking in Persons, that federal department that's under the Administration for Children and Family Services, a commercial sex act is defined as any sex act on account of anything of value given or received by any person. It doesn't have to be received by the victim themselves. It doesn't have to be received by a third person. It could be received by the victim themselves. Anything of value, that piece is really important. So let's just say, for example, I'm working a case here at the CAC. If I know that, one of my kids left a group home and met this guy at a bus stop, and this guy was like, hey, if you come over to my house, like you can sleep over. I know you hated at the group home there. We'll have, I got drugs, I've got alcohol, all this stuff. And then at the very end of it, he says, well, all you got to do is sleep with me. Then those exchanges of shelter, probably transportation, drugs and alcohol, all of those things are value and give it to the victim. And that alone constitutes a commercial sex act. And so sometimes, we might, think that it's bribery or something like that. But for us, in terms of legislation, especially with kids, I can make an argument that this was actually sex trafficking. And once again, when it comes to sex trafficking, this last italicized point that I highlight from this is that force, fraud, or coercion does not need to be proven for victims under the age of 18, which means as long as there is an exchange of something of value for a sex act, and the force, fraud, or coercion piece doesn't need to be proven for kids. It does need to be proven for adults, that adults are forced or frauded into or coerced, let's just say by a relationship, by the false, presentation of a romantic relationship, could be considered coercion. They don't need to have, adults do need to have this piece in order to make a sex trafficking case. Children do not. So moving forward to, my broad definition of commercial sex act, where are we seeing this happening? So once again, Polaris compiled these areas of where they saw sex trafficking happening. So I'm not gonna, in the interest of time, not gonna go over too much of this, but I do want to show this next video that really highlights how this starts happening in the first place. Oh, I'm sorry, you couldn't hear the audio that whole time?
No, I thought maybe it was going to have captions, but then none ever appeared.
I know with Zoom, before I share, I have to click a couple. Oh, there is an audio button on share. Okay, I apologize. The first video also had audio. Let's try this again.
You're 12 years old and you're living with your moms, and your mom's is struggling because she didn't think that life was really going to work out like this for her, and she doesn't have a man around, and the men that are around haven't always been that great. Sexual abuse is becoming kind of normal for you, and you think that other people don't have secrets that are as bad as you, and maybe you've tried to talk to somebody at school and they haven't really heard you, or maybe they just haven't had time to listen to you. And so you're seeing these girls on the videos, and they're so pretty and they're so sexy, and so your way at 12 of escaping into this fantasy world is to think about what it must be like to be one of these girls, and you know that adult men already look at you, and you wonder how you can kind of use that.
I was just a child, and that's how I was supposed to live, like a child and like an adult.
So one day you're coming out of school and there's a guy outside in a Cadillac, and he's nice looking. I mean, he's got the baseball cap and the jeans and the Timbs, and he tells you how pretty you are and you know how pretty your hair looks. And it's been a while since anybody even really noticed anything about you. And for the first time, you feel like somebody's really interested in you, because now all of a sudden he's asking you about your dreams and your hopes and where your father's at. And he says that he can be a daddy to you.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was depending on for support.
And so that night he takes you to a club and he puts you up on the stage and he gives you a few drinks, and there's men throwing dollars at you, and it's scary, but all the time you're just looking at his face in the back of the room, and he's like, you know, go ahead, baby girl, go ahead, you're doing it for daddy. And you're feeling proud because nobody's ever said that to you. And so then that night he tells you that there's more stuff that you've got to do, and he takes you into a room and there's a man there, and he tells you to strip, and you think this is something you'll never do. And yet, there's a part of you that already knew how to do this, because that's what your stepfather's been doing to you all these years before. And so you turn that trick, and it's like a part of you has died inside. And so you come out of the club that night, and you get in the car, and you know he's pumping 50 Cent, and he takes you to McDonald's, and he tells you, you did a good job tonight, sweetie. And he's stuffing his pockets with the $1,000 that he made. And right now, you're happy.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was depending on for support.
And you feel like this is the best that it's ever going to get. And everything else in your life has prepared you for this moment. All the sexual abuse, or the neglect, or the drama, or the pain, or the trauma has prepared you for tonight, where you stepped across a line that you always thought you'd never really quite step across. And you don't realize that night what it'll be like to be on the track and get raped. And you don't realize that daddy isn't really going to protect you. You don't realize what it's like to have a gun held to your head that night. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you catch your first STD. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you first come home and daddy beats you for the first time because you didn't make enough money. You don't know what it's going to be like to have cops offer to trade sex with you in exchange for not being arrested. And then sometimes you do that and they'll still lock you up anyway. You don't know what it's like to sit up in jail and know that you just made $1,500 for your pimp last night, but he won't come down and put $200 bail on just to get you out a few days early. You don't know what it's like to walk down the street at 6 o'clock in the morning when you're just getting off work and people are starting their day and they see you and they know what you do and they look at you in a way that you just don't feel like you belong in that world anymore. And you don't know what it's like to feel like you've lost part of yourself along the way and to feel like you'll never leave. And no matter how many times you try to leave, he'll always find you and catch you. But that night, all you care about is the fact you're riding in a Cadillac and you're eating McDonald's and you're listening to 50 and you got this one man who you really think loves you sitting right by your side.
Does anybody want to share any reactions to that video?
So one thing that came to mind was the going to the club or going to a bar. One thing that servers should do is they check IDs and checking IDs of everyone that's going to enter. And that, you know, when you see that disparity in age and, you know, that can be a stopping point right there.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else have reactions or suggestions like that? So there's a couple of reasons that I show that video, even if we're talking primarily about, victims that you may encounter who are adults. The story depicted a 12-year-old who was being victimized, but we know that we know this after multiple studies, and the video had the statistic in that video that the number one precursor to victimization by sex trafficking is a history of child sexual abuse. And so it puts us in a position here at the Chicago CAC that when we do see children who have experienced child sexual abuse, that we provide as many interventions as the family is open to, in order to prevent future victimization, because we know that statistic to be true too much. So we know that that's a precursor, but we also wanted to highlight this idea that that 12-year-old girl is bonded to her trafficker. And it doesn't matter if she's 12 years old, 24 years old, or 34 years old, it doesn't matter. That trauma bond is typically the biggest obstacle in someone's recovery, or, in someone's ability or willingness, or even, just the idea of like recognizing that they might even want to leave is because of that bond. And when we talk about that bond, trauma bonds is a very kind of social work term. But if you're thinking about it in terms of, Stockholm syndrome, or very similar to relationships that individuals who are in domestic violence relationships are facing, the bulleted words that you see on the slide here, alternating violence and kindness, increases that bonding. And that last bullet point, that shame and stigma, is so common, especially when we're talking about young people, that shame and stigma follow them for so long. They might overcome it with acting out, or something that you might think is super bold, but that shame and stigma does really follow them. With 100% of my kids, they experience some form of that. And so that bond keeps them bonded to their trafficker. I had a child that I was meeting with this week who had come in, made a disclosure, and then when I had talked to her on the phone last week, she was like, "Oh, well, I want to drop it now. I had actually promised this guy that I wouldn't say anything, and now that I want to drop it because I found out what they do to child molesters, and I don't want that to happen to him because he was really nice." A week later, this week, I go see her, and she has the same thing. She's even more convicted that she wants to apologize to this guy, and she wants the case dropped, and she doesn't want anything to happen to him. And that bond that she has with her perpetrator is super strong. And it's going to take a lot and a big team to help her overcome why, thinking that, any of this is her fault, it's going to take a little bit because of that bond. And so I'm going to gloss over some of the next several slides, which are very statistic heavy. And I just want to make sure that, when we talk about human trafficking, we're not ignoring a lot of different issues here, including homelessness and, young people who've experienced homelessness or have run away. A lot of times, if you talk to a lot of other organizations, they might term this as survival sex, especially, with both young people as well as individuals who are LGBTQ. They may be engaging in survival sex because that is literally what they're doing to survive, exchanging sex for food, shelter, transportation, whatever it is, hormones, whatever it might be. And so, but in terms of survival sex, I absolutely understand that term. But when it comes to children, once again, that hotline call needs to be made so that we can try to intervene with services as soon as possible and before they become adult victims of sex trafficking or anything else. And so I talked about very briefly just now about LGBTQ individuals. We know that they face a lot of discrimination. A lot of times people like to use the word homophobia. I like to use the word heterosexism. I think that's much stronger and really, kind of takes it for what it actually is. And so we know that 70% of LGBTQ youth report abuse in foster care. And then once again, sexual abuse is the number one precursor to a future victimization of sex trafficking. And so you can read the statistics for yourself, but we just know that when we talk about human trafficking, we need to also be addressing, obviously, homelessness, heterosexism, and of course, racism. We talk a lot about the city of Chicago just rolled out a gender-based violence initiative that raised a lot of funds or put aside a lot more funds for gender-based violence services. And so we can't have a conversation about gender-based violence, which includes human trafficking, if we're not also having a conversation about racism. And these couple of bullet points here, I'll just read out loud to you that over 40% of victims of sex trafficking are Black women, yet Black women only make up 13% of the US population. And unfortunately, women of color and girls of color are more likely to be trafficked because traffickers or, pimps will believe that they will actually receive less incarceration time if they're caught for trafficking women of color than white women. And so I don't have, there's a reference point there, and I don't have that reference off the top of my head, but if you probably literally just copy and paste my bullet point there word for word into Google, it'll probably come up with several research papers for you there. And so we need to make sure we're having conversations about all of this stuff. And for myself, I actually just compiled my own statistics here at the CAC to look at, of the 193 cases that we saw here, 173 of those were victims that were identified as female. And so that is a huge majority of the cases that we saw here in that last fiscal year. And I kind of totaled all of this here of, the ethnicities that we were able to identify for these 173 cases, and 90% of them are girls of color. And so that's why we cannot ignore this issue because of gross statistics like this. And finally, when we talk about statistics, I want to wrap this up, that there are very few stats for the victimization of men and boys. We know that we are working on creating a culture that allows for men and boys to come forward saying, I need help. If you guys paid attention to the news this morning, you know that there was a former Chicago Blackhawks player who had actually finally come out and said, that's me. I'm the one who made that allegation over 10 years ago that there was an assistant coach who had sexually abused me. And so 10 years later, the case is finally being charged. People have been fired. And I think he's a head coach somewhere now. But I think it's super powerful for men like him to come forward and for those things, to inspire other individuals to be like, oh, if he's coming forward and he is this hockey player, super strong, what we might consider like super manly and masculine, coming forward and saying, this happened to me. We need to keep creating environments like that to allow more boys and men to come forward. I was co-presenting with somebody years ago, and there was a question that was asked by somebody in the audience who was like, well, what are the statistics of, comparison of victimization of boys versus victimization of girls? And somehow this random stat was thrown out of like, well, I think it's 20% boys and, 80% girls. And I was like, whoa, no. We can't rely on any statistics that actually quantify this, in my personal opinion, until we create that culture that allows for men and boys to come forward. But we know that lack of services also continue to be a risk factor for re-exploitation. So, for individuals who are creating programs, unfortunately, it is a chicken or egg thing. I do have a list of resources towards the end of these slides, and Emmaus Ministries is listed as one of those, and they are one of the organizations in the city of Chicago. They're very specifically focused on male-identified individuals who might come forward for services, which is great. And of course, at the CAC, we serve all children, regardless of gender, anywhere on the gender spectrum. And so, as we continue to talk about this conversation, a lot of times where, people log onto these trainings to learn signs to look for, in victims, or we start, educating our young people or educating anybody of like, how do you prevent yourself from becoming a victim? And so too often we're not talking about, the other side of things, like how do you identify perpetrators, or, whatever this might be, like how do we mentor individuals so that they don't become perpetrators, or how do we help them heal from trauma so they don't become perpetrators? And so the unfortunate thing is we know perpetrators exist, and we're also not paying enough attention to the perpetrators that are called sex buyers. We focus so much on traffickers and pimps that there's a whole host of market for this that are called sex buyers. We typically don't like to use the term John because it's so much more fluffy than the term we use for sex workers. So we always want to say sex buyers. And so you can actually go and look at this on case.org. It is purposely 2A's, Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation. They did a study several years ago where they looked at the USA Sex Guide. And this is an online forum for men who are looking to have sex with women. It is only for heterosexual men, and it's an online forum that requires no password, and you can create a profile, but requires no password for you to share information with each other on where to get what in whatever town you might be in, as far as the internet, might expand. And so basically what this researcher had found is that, sex buyers really see this as a hobby, which is why she named the study Our Great Hobby. And one of the things that we need to tackle here as advocates is this idea of why this happens in the first place. And so one of the cleanest quotes that's been published in the study reads, "For everyone, please use your head here. These boards are intended for us to share information. This isn't a contest, just a place where we can share our experience for some good, clean, safe, dirty fun. I've had shared messages with both pros and apprentices, professional and apprentice sex buyers," he means. "And most of you are really great people who want to, purchase sex from other people. You're really great. Let's agree to be respectful of each other as we enjoy this incredibly expensive and risky sport together." So I'm throwing a lot of different perspectives at you in this hour-and-a-half training, but I always want to make sure that we're not just focusing on definitions, we're not just focusing on myths, and we're not just focusing on victims, we're also focusing on perpetrators. And beyond that, we're focusing on more than just the traffickers. And so but back to why, a lot of times we log on to these trainings is these red flags to look for in your establishment. I have this image up here of a tattoo because tattoos are a really common way that traffickers will brand the people who are their victims. And so barcodes have definitely been seen a lot of times. The also chosen PIP name that traffickers will use are also tattooed. And the interesting thing is that, for us as frontline responders, a lot of times these tattoos are very visible in places where victims cannot avoid them. So if you see tattoos on the neck, if you see tattoos, somewhere visible, like on a wrist where you're always looking at your wrist, where you see tattoos, on someone's face, that's like it's someone's name, it's a crown. Those are red flags to us because every single time that victim looks in a mirror, she is reminded who she belongs to. And I use a very gendered term for a victim there with a feminine pronoun because that is the majority of victims that we know. But I also obviously don't want to ignore the fact that there are a number of male identified victims as well. And so tattoos are super common, but other red flags to look for, of course, include, when it comes to labor trafficking, somebody that might be working in that establishment as a host or, as a server, whatever that may be. And though if these staff members are telling you that they can't leave, or like, once again, Michelle, you were saying like, hey, if you're a regular customer and you notice that this person's always working every time you go, maybe you strike up a conversation with them like, hey, like it seems like you're always working here. Maybe that's just a fun, casual conversation, or they may not want to talk to you about it, and that could be a red flag. A staff member shows fear towards their employer, like that should never happen in the first place. You should never be fearful of your employer. But some of these signs that are kind of trying to make you think like, hey, something is happening here. When it comes to customers, are you starting to notice that there's a controlling relationship between one customer and the person that they might be with, or a group of people that they might be with? Is one person, controlling the other person in their party, and is that other person in their party avoiding eye contact with not just you, but also avoiding eye contact with anybody else? Because there are rules to pimping. And one of those rules is that you do not make eye contact with anybody else unless it is your trafficker, unless it is your daddy who's telling you to make eye contact. You do not make eye contact with other people unless they give you permission to do that. And then, is that person, like I said before, is that person not allowed to be alone? They need to go to the bathroom. Are they followed to the bathroom? Or, is there a group of customers that always go to the bathroom? Of course, girls, we always go to the bathroom together. That's just what we do. But you know how to put these combinations of bullet points together to note that something might be happening here. And then that person who is that controlling relationship, is he holding everyone's IDs? Like, when you're asking for IDs, is he the one who is, throwing out the IDs at the bouncer? And, is anybody else carrying money, or is that one person in this group who's carrying money? And then all of a sudden, like, other people start coming to the group, start drinking with them, and that same person keeps throwing out the money to buy more drinks. If there's language that you overhear that's commonly used in the sex industry, including like daddy, trick, the life, or my sisters-in-law, whatever it might be. Of course, none of these single bullet points necessarily obviously would constitute sex trafficking, but just obviously pay attention to the combination of these things. And then we know in Chicago, it's already getting cold. If they're inappropriately clothed for the weather, that could also be a sign. Obviously, granted, I was also 19, 20, 21 years old once, and I also used to be inappropriately clothed to go out. I'm a lot smarter, a lot wiser these days. But once again, that key bullet point, or the key point, is to put these bullet points together as you start noticing that there's these red flags. this is kind of my list, for you. But if there are other things, like I want to make sure that we get this in this training. So, are there things that I've missed when we talk about red flags to look for, either in coworkers or if you're a customer, like the people that work there, or in customers that you might be serving? Any other red flags? If not, I can also give you a list of resources that you can publish underneath the YouTube caption, if this is going to get uploaded on a platform like that. So I have this in here for you to look at for yourself if you want to. When we talk about making sure that we're also having conversations about perpetrators, once again, back to that statistic that the #1 precursor or risk factor for future sex trafficking is a history of child sexual abuse. We also want to make sure that in our everyday lives that we're watching for behaviors when adults are with children. There's a lot of these bullet points here that you can start looking for. And once again, people unfortunately perpetrate against people that they already know. So obviously not, it's a red flag every aunt and uncle that comes into your house, but is there somebody that you have welcomed to your home that seems to always have time and seems to always offer, like, oh, I can watch your kid. Oh yeah. Oh, I just bought this for your child. It's no big deal. Every single time I have a new gift for your child. Or, is that person always frequently telling dirty or suggestive jokes when the child is present, inappropriate sexual jokes when the child is present? Or, even when the child like already is feeling uncomfortable and like, that adult insists on being like, oh, come here, and puts their arm around them when the child is clearly uncomfortable and doesn't recognize, maybe they just don't recognize social cues, or maybe there's just an adult that you need to be a little bit more careful about. Something that might be of interest to folks here, compile some anecdotal statistics or anecdotes from the last couple of years of hearing from law enforcement all across the country, as well as individuals who have lived experience of being in the life during COVID-19, especially. These are more for 2020. I don't really have a lot of anecdotes for 2021. We did see an increase in street-based prostitution. We, as in the people that I heard from. There was, of course, an increase in sharing of child sexual abuse material by children themselves, especially in the 8 to 9-year-old category, because, when you're stuck at home alone and you no longer have your friends to go to who are encouraging you at school, in your sport, whatever that might be, then you're going to go online for those likes and that popularity. And so you get more likes, and which feels like, you're getting more and more popular with the exchange of child sexual abuse material. We really try to change the terminology. The more we learn, the reason I'm using child sexual abuse material instead of child porn is because it's child sexual abuse material is more really what it is. It defines exactly what it is that it's child sexual abuse material. So we do try to stop using the phrase child pornography these days. And then when it comes to individuals that I've worked with, we did unfortunately see a higher incidences of young people who were going on run, which means they were going missing, and unfortunately going to people who, they may have met online who offered them something, and that grooming phase of, oh, if you just come meet with me, I can buy you a meal, I can buy you a phone, I can buy you whatever it is your parents aren't letting you get. And then of course that grooming period of gifts and encouragement then leads to something else. So unfortunately, we did see a lot of that. So unfortunately, COVID-19 did nothing to curtail trafficking. When we talk about gaps in services, I just have the slide up here if you're interested. We always need more mentors. And we need mentors for, unstructured programming. A lot of the mentor agencies, require kids to follow a structured, week by week programming, or we have to meet at this certain time every single week. Or, if you don't show up, 3 times in a row, then you're kicked out of the program. And that's not the type of mentorship that we need for our kids here. We know that we need flexibility. We need to meet the child where they're at. And if they disappear for 6 months, that you're right back at it 6 months later. So that is a huge need. When I first started doing this work, somebody has suggested, well, why don't we just identify where brothels are, those private homes and private businesses, and kick those doors down? doesn't work that way. If we're looking for prevention of future victimization, we're really looking for mentors. And then, of course, action steps that you can take is plugging in that telephone number into your phone. I will say, because of the trauma bound, and because, you know, if you're working in an establishment, you know, that's a bar, a restaurant, or a hotel, something like that, you're probably likely, if you're going to have red flags, run into adult victims who may not even want help. Most of the individuals who we encounter don't really want help. So I would actually suggest that you have a resource there, either a card of a local agency that you can make a referral to, or if there's somewhere, you know, let's just say you're posting that telephone number on these required postings. But a lot of times individuals aren't allowed their own phone. If they're really in control of somebody who is controlling them 24/7, they may not have a phone, or their phone is monitored. They're not going to make that phone call. They're not going to make that text message. So get creative. What else can you have? Is there, you know, a local organization that, you know, has lipsticks? You know, there's a lot of organizations that have gotten really creative. They might have like a compact mirror in a lipstick, but then there's actually a telephone number in there, inside there, that if they get to a telephone, then they can call that number. And it may not say human trafficking. It may just be a telephone number that you can, you know, reach out to a local organization and see if they have some of those compact mirrors or lipstick cases. And it's just there that if you suspect that somebody might need help, just see if they want a mirror, see if they want a lipstick. Because once again, you know, posting that telephone number, I think is really helpful for you and I who might suspect that human trafficking might be happening, but for the individual who is the actual victim, they may not be able to actually make that telephone call. So when it comes to Chicago and Illinois resources, most of these organizations, I will say, are in Chicago, but there's organizations outside of Chicago, which include A Safe Place, the Harbor, Center for Prevention of Abuse. Those are all outside of Chicago. And so I always want to make sure that I'm not the last voice you hear on these trainings. So I'm going to show you one last video of amazing survivors who have lent their images to this video.
Dinner was strange and the day been long. Sat at the head, through she was gone. Sat back and smiled, the uncomfortable while they were watching you. Starting to smile, but my heart was breaking. My heart was breaking into 10 tiny little pieces. My heart was breaking. My heart was breaking into 10 tiny little pieces for you. Morning had come without warning. The sun shone softly like an old photograph. The house had been still like the strength of your will. Children singing their praise to the promise of better days. But my heart was breaking. My heart was breaking into 10 tiny little pieces. My heart was breaking. My heart was breaking into 10 tiny little pieces. My heart was breaking. My heart was breaking into 10 tiny little pieces. I hope you find the reasons for you. For you.
Just kidding, I will be the last voice. We do have additional trainings, of course. If you have other people in your life that you would want to bring a training to, either for youth or for professionals. And then this is my contact information here at the end.